The fields were already dark when the last bell rang from the village church. Not the full darkness of night, but the low, colorless dusk that settles quietly over rural land when shadows stretch long and the air grows still. It was in this narrow hour, between day and night, that the first unusual report was later said to have occurred. The year was 1894. The place was the agricultural outskirts of Lower Brackenridge, a small farming settlement situated along the eastern lowlands, bordered by marsh grass, wheat fields, and a narrow canal used for irrigation and transport. Records from parish archives describe the village as modest, with fewer than 300 residents. Most families worked the land. Life followed predictable patterns: morning bells, field labor, evening meals, silence after sunset. Among the youth of Lower Brackenridge was a small group informally known as the Village Scouts. They were not soldiers, nor officially appointed guards. Rather, they were adolescent boys, aged between 14 and 17, tasked by landowners to assist with boundary checks, fence repairs, and livestock observation during harvest season. Their duties kept them walking the outer fields at dawn and dusk, when theft and animal intrusion were most likely, according to later statements preserved in a county ledger, dated November of that year. 5 boys regularly worked together. Thomas Ellery, son of a mill worker; Samuel Brooke, whose family kept sheep; Alfred Crane, apprenticed to a carpenter; Matthew Rowe, the eldest of the group, and younger, Edwin Hale, recently assigned to accompany them. Their patrol routes took them past the western barley plots, across the low ridge near the canal, and along the hedgerows where foxes were known to pass. Nothing about the routine was unusual, at least not at first. But in early October, subtle irregularities began appearing. Farmers noted gates left ajar, despite being properly latched the evening before. Footpaths through tall grass appeared pressed down in narrow lines, not wide enough for carts, and not consistent with livestock trails. One landowner, Edward Morley, recorded in his personal notebook that several rows of wheat showed uneven flattening, as if something had moved through carefully, avoiding the heavier stalks. These observations were not alarming on their own. Rural life often brought small mysteries: wind, animals, careless workers. The village carried on. Yet, the scouts themselves would later describe a growing sense of unease in the days leading up to the incident. Not fear, not panic. Something quieter. They spoke of the fields becoming unnaturally silent in the evenings, of birds leaving hedgerows earlier than usual, of dogs refusing to follow their normal paths near the canal. Edwin Hale, in a short statement written months later, described the air as heavy, though the weather was fair, and said that walking the western boundary felt as though one were being observed, though nothing was visible. No action was taken, no warnings were issued. There was no reason, at the time, to treat these impressions as more than youthful imagination. On the afternoon of October 17th, the group was instructed to make a routine circuit of the outer fields before nightfall. The sun was already low. A pale haze lingered near the marsh. The wind had dropped entirely. They left the village just after the evening meal. What they encountered later that evening would not be recorded in official newspapers until weeks afterward, and even then, the language was restrained, careful, uncertain. But this was the last ordinary patrol they would make, and it began like any other, with boots on dirt paths, with quiet conversation, and with no expectation that anything would be waiting for them in the fields. The patrol began without incident. According to the boys' later accounts, they followed their usual route along the barley fields, moving westward toward the canal. The light was thinning, but visibility remained sufficient. The sky was overcast, holding a dull gray color that flattened the landscape and softened distant shapes. They walked in a loose formation, Matthew Rowe at the front, Edwin Hale trailing behind. None of them carried firearms. At most, they had short wooden staffs used for clearing brush and guiding livestock. It was near the narrow ridge above the canal that the first disturbance occurred. Thomas Ellery was the first to stop walking. He later stated that he had heard what he initially believed to be water movement, the sound of reeds shifting along the canal bank, but the noise did not follow the rhythm of the current. It came in uneven intervals. 3 short disturbances, followed by silence, then another. The group paused. They listened. There was no visible movement in the grass, no rippling in the water. The sound stopped entirely. At first, they dismissed it as a small animal slipping through reeds. Samuel Brooks suggested a badger. Alfred Crane suggested a stray dog. Matthew ordered them to continue. They had taken no more than 20 additional steps when Edwin Hale called out quietly from the rear. He reported seeing movement in the far wheat rows to their left. Not fast, not sudden. A slow bending of stalks, progressing inward, as though something was moving against the direction of the wind. Yet there was no wind at all. The boys turned and watched. For several seconds, the wheat remained still. Then the stalks shifted again. A narrow disturbance passed through the field in a straight line, stopping abruptly near the edge of the ridge. No shape emerged. Matthew again attempted a rational explanation. He suggested uneven settling of the soil, or a delayed response from earlier breezes. But Thomas noted something unusual. The flattened path was too deliberate, too narrow, and it did not widen as animal trails typically do. Matthew ordered them to continue their patrol, but instructed the group to remain closer together. Several minutes later, as they moved along the hedgerow, Alfred Crane reported a second disturbance. The others confirmed, noticing it only after it was pointed out. Again, they stopped. Again, nothing was visible. By the following morning, word of the scouts' unease had already spread quietly through Lower Brackenridge. It did not circulate as rumor of a creature or threat. Rather, it was spoken of as strange movement in the western fields. Farmers discussed it in low voices near the mill and outside the parish store. Some dismissed the boy's account outright. Others suggested wandering livestock from neighboring land. A few older residents recalled similar disturbances from years prior, though no details were offered publicly. Despite this, work continued. The harvest could not be delayed, and by late afternoon, landowners requested that the patrol resume, if only to ensure no fences had been damaged. Matthew Rowe, reluctant but responsible for organizing the group, agreed to return, though only with daylight remaining. This time, 2 adult laborers accompanied them for the first portion of the route, separating near the ridge to attend to drainage work along the canal. The scouts proceeded alone once more. The environment had changed. Several witnesses later remarked that the western fields appeared unsettled. Birds lifted from hedgerows in brief, scattered bursts. Sheep along the eastern fence pressed closer together than usual. The wind remained absent, yet the grass showed irregular patterns of flattening in multiple directions. The group moved slowly, near the same location where the previous disturbance occurred. Thomas Ellery stopped again. On the soil beside the wheat rows, they observed impressions, not footprints in the usual sense. There were no defined shapes, no clear heel or toe marks. Instead, there were shallow depressions, elongated and uneven, arranged in a staggered pattern. The spacing was inconsistent. Some marks were close together, others were separated by nearly twice the distance. Matthew measured the distance with his staff and noted that the pattern did not match known livestock gait. Samuel Brooks suggested dragging equipment, but there were no parallel grooves, no metal scoring, no signs of wheels. They followed the impressions briefly before they disappeared into firmer ground near the canal embankment. It was at this point that Alfred Crane reported seeing movement again. Across the canal, beyond the tall reeds, he claimed to see a darker region within the grass, not shaped like a body, but like a shifting absence of light. He described it later as a place where the field did not reflect the sky. The others attempted to locate it, but by the time they turned their attention in that direction, nothing distinct remained. What followed unsettled them more than the previous evening's events. The canal water, normally slow and audible, had become unnaturally still. The surface showed no ripples. No insects touched it. Even where reeds brushed the edge, the water did not respond as expected. They stood in silence for nearly a full minute. Then, without warning, the stillness broke. A single disturbance passed through the reeds on the far bank. Not rapid, not chaotic. A controlled movement, low to the ground, traveling parallel to their position. The reeds bent inward, then slowly returned upright as though released. No sound followed. Matthew ordered the group to withdraw immediately. They did not run, but they moved with urgency, keeping their eyes fixed on the canal line until distance obscured it. When they reached open farmland closer to the village, several of them noticed that the metallic scent reported the previous evening had returned. Stronger now, lingering faintly on the air. That night, 2 unrelated households reported their dogs refusing to leave barns after sunset. Another farmer discovered a section of fencing pressed inward, not broken, but bowed, as though something had leaned against it with sustained pressure. Still, no direct evidence was found. No bodies, no damaged crops beyond compression, no clear tracks. By the 3rd day, the patrols were suspended entirely. The western fields were left unattended after dusk, and in the quiet spaces between work and sleep, villagers began to acknowledge something they had not spoken aloud before. Whatever was moving near the canal was not behaving like a wandering animal. It was returning, and it appeared to be approaching closer each evening. The point of restraint was near, though no one yet understood what would finally force the village to confront it. And that moment was drawing steadily nearer. The decision to avoid the western fields did not last. By the 4th evening, livestock agitation and unverified reports forced a return, though not under the authority of routine patrol. This time, it was not the scouts alone. 2 adult men accompanied them part way, Edward Morley and a farmhand named Joseph Lint, both carrying lanterns and walking with visible reluctance. The sun was already setting when they reached a boundary near the canal. Morley later wrote that the light behaved strangely there. The lantern glow did not travel far. Shadows pooled closer than expected, pressing in around fence posts and reeds. The canal itself reflected nothing. Not the sky, not the flame. They had gone no more than a few yards past the ridge when the dogs reacted. One of Morley's farm dogs, usually steady and obedient, halted abruptly, its ears flattened. It refused to advance further, pulling hard against its lead. A second dog, belonging to Lint, whined low in its throat and attempted to retreat toward the village. The men stopped. At that moment, all present reported hearing movement, not from the reeds, not from the wheat, but from within the grass between them and the canal. The sound was not a rush or scramble. It was slow, deliberate, a steady compression of stalks, advancing laterally, as though something were repositioning itself without haste. Lanterns were raised. The light revealed no figure, yet the grass responded to pressure. Narrow bands of stalks bent inward, not snapping, not tearing, but yielding in sequence. The disturbance traveled from right to left, stopping only when it reached a shadowed line near the water. No one spoke. Joseph Lint later testified that he believed, for a brief moment, that whatever caused the movement was aware of being observed, not through any visible reaction, but through the timing of its stillness. The canal surface rippled once, then again, then fell completely still. At this point, Edwin Hale broke formation and stepped backward without instruction. His movement was instinctive, abrupt enough to draw attention. As his boot shifted in the soil, the grass near the canal moved again. This time, it advanced toward them, not quickly, but unmistakably closer. The dogs strained violently, barking now, though the sound seemed muted, as if absorbed by the air. One lantern flickered, then steadied, casting elongated shadows that distorted the field's depth. Morley called out. His voice carried no command, no threat. It was simply a human presence, announced into the dark. There was no reply, but the movement stopped. The grass remained pressed down in a shape that suggested proximity without revealing form. The space between the flattened stalks and the nearest fence post measured no more than several paces. Matthew Rowe later stated that this was the moment he understood they were not witnessing random disturbance. The positioning was intentional. The advance had halted at a distance that felt considered. No further approach was made. After several long seconds, the pressure eased. The grass slowly lifted. The field returned to stillness, though the impression of wear. The group did not remain to observe whether the disturbance would return. Morley ordered an immediate withdrawal. The lanterns were lowered and shielded as they retreated uphill toward the village, moving in silence except for the strained breathing of the dogs and the faint clatter of equipment. No one ran. Yet the pace was deliberate, unbroken, and tense, as though any sudden motion might draw unwanted attention. They reached the first outer cottages just as full night settled over Lower Brackenridge. Within the hour, several households were informed, not through formal announcement, but through hurried conversation, whispered explanation, and concerned visitors arriving at neighbors' doors. The language used was careful. No one claimed to have seen a creature. No one named what had occurred. Instead, it was described as movement without form and pressure in the field. The parish warden recorded the incident the following morning. His notes were brief and restrained. He wrote of disturbance near canal, livestock agitation, and youth witnesses unsettled. There was no speculation included, only observations. The western fields were officially closed after dusk. Temporary fencing was erected near the ridge. Lantern patrols were discontinued. Farmers adjusted grazing routes. Children were instructed not to wander beyond the inner hedgerows. Though no proclamation was made, behavior throughout the village changed. Sleep became irregular. Several residents reported waking during the night to the sound of distant movement near the canal. No one could describe it clearly. Some thought it was water shifting. Others described low compression sounds, similar to wind passing through tall grass, though the air remained still. Dogs barked more frequently. Then, over the following nights, they barked less. Some refused to leave barns at all. A shepherd reported finding his flock pressed tightly together one morning, standing in the far corner of the field, facing away from the canal, despite no visible threat. The scouts themselves were affected in quieter ways. Edwin Hale was withdrawn from patrol duties entirely. His mother later wrote to a relative that he refused to walk alone after sunset and avoided the western paths even during daylight. Samuel Brooke complained of recurring dreams involving the canal bank. Thomas Ellery requested reassignment to mill work. Matthew Rowe remained silent publicly, but his private journal contains one brief entry written 3 days after the incident. "We did not see it, yet it stood near us. I believe this is worse. No further direct encounters occurred in the days immediately following. But the physical signs did not cease. Compressed grass lines reappeared intermittently near the ridge. Fence posts showed slight shifts, as though pushed at their bases. The metallic scent returned on 2 recorded evenings, faint but noticeable to those working nearby. The village council debated whether to request outside assistance. Some suggested bringing in constables. Others feared ridicule. Lower Brackenridge had no desire to become known for hysteria or superstition. In the end, they chose documentation over confrontation. Statements were collected, dates were recorded, locations marked, and quietly, without formal declaration, the Western Canal region became a place people avoided. Yet what troubled the villagers most was not what had happened. It was what had not happened. There had been no clear departure, no sign of retreat, only the persistent impression that something had been present, and may still have been. And it was this uncertainty that would shape how the event was remembered and how it would slowly fade into incomplete record. Because what came next was not another confrontation, but something quieter, and in many ways, more unsettling. Which brings us to the final stage of the account, the part that exists only in paper fragments, oral memory, and long silence. By early winter of 1894, the disturbances near the canal ceased. There was no final event, no closing confrontation, no clear resolution. The movement simply stopped being reported. The compressed grass lines no longer appeared. Livestock behavior slowly returned to normal. The metallic scent was not noted again after mid-November. Life in Lower Brackenridge resumed its familiar rhythm, but the documentation remained. In county archives, a small collection of statements survives. Most are brief, carefully worded, free of speculation. They describe environmental irregularities, unexplained movement, and unusual animal responses. None attempt to define what was encountered. Several accounts emphasize what was not seen more than what was. One local newspaper made a short mention in December of that year, buried near the bottom of the page. It referred to unsettled field conditions and temporary suspension of Western patrols. No follow-up article was printed. Matthew Rowe's journal ends abruptly in early 1895. There are no further entries related to the incident. He later left the village to work on a rail project farther south. Edwin Hale moved with his family 2 years afterward. Thomas Ellery remained in Lower Brackenridge, but never again participated in field patrols. Oral accounts passed quietly between families, altered with time. Some claimed the movement had been larger. Others insisted it had been smaller. Some said it followed the canal. Others believed it came from the marsh. Details shifted. Certainty did not. What remained consistent across versions was the same core absence. No one ever described a face. No one recorded limbs. No one gave it a name. Only movement without form. Presence without visibility. Pressure without explanation. Modern historians who later examined the parish records offered rational possibilities. Unusual animal behavior. Ground settling near waterlogged soil. Wind effects amplified by terrain. Psychological suggestion among closely connected witnesses. Each explanation accounted for part of the event. None accounted for all of it. And so Lower Brackenridge never became famous. There were no monuments, no plaques, no official investigations preserved in national archives. The incident remained what it had always been, a quiet anomaly recorded by ordinary people who did not claim to understand what they had experienced. Today, the canal still runs through the old western fields. The ridge remains. The hedgerows are thinner now. The barley fields long replaced by modern farming plots. There is nothing visible to mark what occurred there. And yet, in the few surviving written fragments, one detail stands out. Again and again, witnesses emphasized not fear, but attention. The sensation of being noticed, not threatened, not pursued, simply observed. And when the movement finally stopped, it did not feel like departure. It felt like absence, which is why, more than a century later, the event is not remembered as an encounter with something extraordinary, but as a brief moment when the familiar landscape of ordinary life behaved in a way that did not fully belong to it. And then, just as quietly, returned to silence.